Today I'm going to show you how I edit my astrophotography images. Taking a photograph and editing a photograph are two different skills you need as a photographer nowadays to produce some great images. I've shown you many ways to take the photographs, but not too many ways to edit them. So today I have a few different astrophotography shots I have taken, and I'll show you how I go from a raw file to a finished edited file. I will be doing this in Lightroom, but no matter what editing program you're using, as long as you have those basic sliders, you should be able to follow along. So if you're using a program like Darktable, Capture One, or Luminar, you should be able to do everything that I'm doing. There may be a few functions missing, say if you're in an older version of Lightroom or you're in one of these other programs, but you should be able to follow along with most of the steps that I do. You also need a bit of an understanding of editing in general, and you'll need to know your editing software. So if you're not sure about this, and you're not sure about how to edit your photos, or you're not sure how to use Lightroom, click on the eye in the corner or the link in the description to another of my tutorials. I have been meaning to do this tutorial for a while, but haven't got around to it. So being in lockdown, I thought this would be the perfect time to do it. So if you've got any astrophotography images that you haven't edited yet, or you've got some that you're not quite happy with, hopefully I'll be able to show you a thing or two to try and get the best out of them. I basically try and keep that editing time down, and also I want to bring the most out of my photos. So that's what we're aiming for today. Now this is my editing process, but there are many different ways to get to the same results. That's the thing with editing programs. There's lots of different sliders, lots of different panels, and some of them will actually do the same thing. I'll just show you what I do, so hopefully you can learn from that. So here are the images that I'm going to go through. These have been edited, but I'm going to reset all of these. These first few are in a poutre on the Coromandel Peninsula. And with these, there was a fair bit of moonlight coming in on this one, coming in from the right. And then I turned around and this one, it was coming in from the left. And you can see the shadow underneath the picnic table. I was really surprised at how much the Milky Way was out, even though there was 25% moonlight. Now, even though all of these locations are fantastic night skies, I'm going to show you a few others where I had a few problems. This next one, I underexposed the shot and there was a lot of dust in the atmosphere. So this one was a little bit more tricky, so I'm going to go through that. This next one, again, there was a good night sky, but there was quite a lot of light pollution on the horizon. And this last one, this was at a Bortle 4 or 5 location and there was a lot of light on the horizon. You can just about see the Milky Way. But this one was a little bit tricky. So I'll show you how I edit my photos from the really good night skies right through to the ones that have pretty bad night skies, or say they're at a Bortle 4 or a 5 location. So as you can see, I've reset all of my images back to their defaults and as I took them, and they're quite underexposed. I did take these on the A7R II, and that has an ISO invariant sensor. So this means I can drop the exposure down when I'm taking the shot, but then I'll still have a lot of detail in that shot that I can bring back. Now my reasoning for this was because I didn't want the stars to start streaking, so I was quite conservative with my exposure time. On this one, in a poutre of the picnic table, I had a 15-second exposure with the ISO at 3200. I could have dropped the ISO down a little bit more, but I just kept it at that so I could actually see what was on the back of the screen. It's not showing, but I had the aperture at f2.8, and this was with a 14mm Samyang. Now the first thing that I do is do the lens corrections. So if you come down to lens corrections, it may be up like that, so just click on the triangle and bring it down. You can go through this and find your lens. So I've got a Samyang, it's the 14mm. Next thing, because I have underexposed these shots, I'm going to bring the exposure up. With this, I'm probably going to bring them up about 2 stops. Then I'm going to add a bit of contrast. And whenever I'm editing my shots, I'll tend to grab hold of a slider and slide it one way or the other quite a lot to see what it's actually doing to the shot. And then I'll sort of bring it in and get it to the position where I want it. And then the same with the shadows. So you can really see when you slide it from side to side what it's actually doing to your image. So again, with the shadows, I'll bring those up. Then I'm going to add a little bit more contrast with the whites and with the blacks. Then I'm going to add a bit of clarity. Now in this shot, the sky is quite blue, and I had my white balance set to tungsten. And I always do this because on the back of the camera, it just seems to me to look nicer with that color. If you have it in daylight, everything looks quite yellow, and I don't really like that look. So I always set my white balance to tungsten, and then I've got a nicer looking image on the back of my camera. You don't have to do this, especially if you're shooting in RAW. And if you're doing astrophotography shots, you really should be shooting in RAW. So with this next tip that I'm going to show you about how to get your white balance spot on pretty much every time, I learned this off a fantastic astrophotographer called Alan Wallace. He's got a YouTube page, and I'll link it at the end of this video. Basically, what you need to do is get your vibrant slider and your saturation slider and push them all the way to the right. This is only temporary, and we're going to bring these back down afterwards, but it really accentuates the colors in that sky. So as you can see, my sky is really blue at the moment, so I'm going to bring it up. So what you want to do is get it balanced so it's kind of half blue, half yellow. I'm ignoring the magenta in the sky at the moment because we're going to go onto that slider. If I go too far to the yellow side of the white balance temperature slider, the sky is bright yellow. If I go too far to the left, the sky is blue. So you just almost want to get a balance between the two, so it's half and half. And then the same with the green magenta slider, the tint slider. So there's loads of magenta in, so if I go all the way to the right, everything goes magenta. If I go all the way to the left, everything goes green. So you just want to get it to the point where it's kind of half and half. It's probably about there. Then double click on vibrance and double click on saturation. Now that gives you a really nice balanced sky. Now I'm going to use that as a starting point, and then I'm going to drag that temperature slider towards the blue side a little bit. Because with some images, I like to make that sky a little bit bluer than normal. So this is down to personal preference. You may not like this, but it's something that I like to make some of my images pop or make them look a little bit different. So I'm going to pull that a little bit towards the blue, but not too much, but just a hint of blue. And that's probably going to be about it. Bring the vibrance up. Now that's about it. Because I had all of that moonlight coming in from the left-hand side, that's lit the ground really well. And that's meant that I haven't had to edit the ground too much at all. One thing I will get rid of are these signposts. And with the spot removal tool, you can get rid of these. So all I'll do is paint over them, and let's try and get rid of them. Let's get this up here. Heal. That's got rid of one of them. Let's try and get rid of the other side. That's got rid of those. So all I did there was just paint over them with the spot healing tool, and this got rid of them. I then moved the part that it was taking that sample from to part of that background, so part of where those trees were in the background, as this was quite neutral and it blended in quite well around it. You can tweak this a bit more, but that's all I need to do. So the last thing that I do is come down to sharpening. I'll take my sharpening up to around about 60, but then I'll hold down Option or Alt, then click on masking, and then I'll put a mask over that. All it will do then is sharpen the white bits, and then it will leave alone the dark bits. And then noise reduction, I'll bump this up a little bit. With luminance in this noise reduction slider, the most I'll do is take it up to 20. I'll never go past that. If you do take this slider up loads, like that, It really gives a painterly look to your sky. That's the last thing that you want. So I just take it to 20 at the most. So for this one, I'm going to put it on 15. And that's about it. So that's all you need to do when you get a good exposure of the sky. So if we move on to this next one, again, I underexposed this and this was looking the opposite way. So the call was behind me, but this bridge looked really good. And I also had a really interesting orange glow in the distance. I think there was a house around the corner, but it had really dim lights around that house. So I'm going to do the same. So I'll bring my exposure up and add a tiny bit of contrast. And I'm going to drop those highlights down quite a bit. So I want that glow on the horizon to drop, and that's what the highlights tends to do. So you're getting rid of that brighter bit on the horizon. And I'm going to bring my shadows up because that's going to affect this area where all those shadows are. And then I'll boost that contrast a bit more with the whites and with the blacks. And then to make it a little bit crispier, add a bit of clarity. With the clarity slider, you need to be quite conservative. If you add loads of clarity, it really shows that you just pulled the clarity slider all the way to the right. So just be really conservative about how much you put on with these sliders. Again, it all comes down to personal preference. You want to make it look as natural as you possibly can. One thing I didn't do is the corrections for the lens. So again, I was using the Samyang on this. You can see I've saved a user preset for my Samyang 14mm. I'll just bring the exposure slider down because adding those lens corrections made the shot a little bit overexposed. Then I'll add some sharpening again. And I'll mask it off so it's only sharpening those edges and not sharpening all of the noise as well. And again, I'll push the noise up to about 11. And that's that one. So we've got those two edited. One other thing I'll change is that white balance again. So again, I'll put my vibrance and saturation up. I'll pull it away from that blue color to about there. And I'll pull the magenta down a touch. And we'll see what that looks like. Now the sky is nice and balanced there, but the ground is a little bit yellow. So once again, I'll pull it back towards that blue color to make this ground look a little bit more natural. Yeah, that'll do. And there, I think that's quite a nice exposure. Maybe bring the overall exposure up a little bit. So as you can see, editing astrophotography images doesn't have to be hard. You don't have to spend too much time. One thing I see people do time and time again is almost select the Milky Way and try and bring out the colors of that, or try and paint in parts of that Milky Way. This is a little bit tricky, and it also can make it look very unnatural very quickly. So I try and avoid that. Like I said in a few of my other videos, the best thing you can do is get to the darkest sky you can possibly find. And find it with a Milky Way in it if you want that in the shot, or just find a star-filled sky. But the darker that you can get it, and the further down that Bortle scale you can go, the better. The clearer the sky, the more stars you'll see, and the less pollution, the more stars you'll see, but ultimately the less light pollution, the more stars you'll see as well. So get yourself to one of those locations, even if you plan a vacation around one of those locations, and you'll get some fantastic starry filled skies. So on this next one, it was at that same location, but I pointed the camera straight up. I think this was a little bit later on in the night. I was on my Samyang 14mm again. I took it at 30 seconds, an ISO of 2500. So first of all, I'll put the lens correction on with that Samyang 14mm preset that I had. If we scroll down just to make sure it's there. Then I'll bring the exposure up a bit. Not too much though. I'll add a bit of contrast. And then you can see it gets quite blue when I put that contrast in. So again, I'm going to take my vibrance and saturation up. And as you can see, there's loads of blue in there. So I'm going to pull this away from that blue point. I'm not going to go too yellow. I'm not going to go too blue. So it's balancing that in the middle. And then the same with the green and magenta. At the moment, there's a lot of magenta, and that's just a subtle drop in that slider. So now I'll zero the vibrance and saturation. And there you go. It's quite a balanced shot. And I'm probably going to push the blue a little bit. There we go. So as you can see, I'm just tweaking that highlight slider back and forth again, just to see which side will be better. The same with the shadows. And I'm going to bring the whites up quite a bit and push the blacks down quite a bit. Now with a shot like this, just of the Milky Way, where you're looking straight up and there's no land or anything in it, you can be really quite aggressive with the sliders. So we can see I brought that black slider down quite a bit, and I brought the white slider up quite a bit, as well as the highlights and the shadows. And this has made that core of the Milky Way really pop. And I'm going to add a little bit of clarity to push it a little bit more, but not too much. And that's about it. Then again, I'll add some sharpening. I'm going to mask that off, so it's just sharpening the stars and not the background. And I'll add a little bit of noise reduction. So if we look at these two shots, the sliders are in quite a different position. Now you can see the difference with the sky, whereas in this first one, it's a bit bluer and the sky's a bit brighter. Whereas in this one that I've just edited, the sky's a bit darker. So at the same location, you can produce very different images. So the next one is at one of those dark locations. It was really dark, and I think I underexposed this shot a little bit too much. I did light paint the dune in front of me with the torch on my phone, and that has a greeny yellow tint to the light on that phone. So like we've done before, first of all, get your exposure where you want it. And there, as soon as I bring that exposure up, you can really see how dusty it is on that horizon. And with the Samyang again, so I'm going to put that lens correction in. So if we scroll down, let's put it in. Now I need to bring that exposure back down. Now you may notice that the sand dune is really green, and I'm going to change that in a little bit. But first of all, I'm going to work my way through these basic sliders again. I'm going to do what I always have done with the other shots. Contrast up a bit. And then highlights. Okay, now highlights down on this one. I'll bring my shadows up quite a bit. The whites up quite a bit. And the blacks down a touch, but not too much. Because this one was quite underexposed, and because it's quite a dark place anyway, it's very easy to push things really into the shadows. So I'm going to leave it at that and probably add a bit of clarity. And now I'm going to sort this green sand dune out, because we all know that sand dunes aren't green. So I'm going to use my graduated filter. I'm going to drag that up over that. And now I'm going to really be quite aggressive with the white balance. And that's got rid of most of that green. Now I'm going to drop the saturation down a touch because I want it to look natural. I don't want a bright sand dune, so I'm just going to drop that down a little bit. Also, there's a lot of noise in here as well. So I'm going to smoothen that off quite a bit. Then the highlights. This is really drawing the eye to this sand dune. So I just want to drop my highlights down and bring the contrast up a touch. Now the sky is looking quite green again, so I'm going to pull the tint slider away from that green, but not too much. And a little bit away from that blue edge, but not too much again. And the last thing I'm going to do, add a bit of sharpness, mask it off by holding down Option or Alt, and a bit of noise reduction. I'm going to push this one up to 20 because it was a noisy shot. And even though I started with really dark image with not much detail in it, I think I've brought out a little bit from that image. It's not the best image in the world, but it's not the worst either. But as you can see, in going through these basic sliders, you can really make that Milky Way pop, even from quite an average shot. This was a Bortle 2 location, so it was a really dark place, but because I underexposed that shot, it was really hard to bring out those details. One other thing I'd probably do as well, is probably would cut it down and bring that Milky Way, maybe not that actually. I'd probably get that Milky Way in the middle, maybe somewhere there. So it's kind of cutting straight down the middle of the shot. As I said, it's not the best shot, but it's not the worst shot either. So with this next one of the road, I've got some light pollution on the horizon. I'm stood in the middle of the road, and if you're going to take a shot like this, make sure you're on a really quiet road. I think we saw about 2 or 3 cars coming along this road at any one time, but I was always checking behind me to make sure nothing was coming. So if you are going to do a shot like this, just be very careful. With this, I've got a good exposure of the night sky. I had it at ISO 5000, 30-second exposure. Again, I was using my Samyang 14mm at f2.8. So the first thing, bring the exposure up. As you can see, that sky is a little bit blue. So we're going to use Alan Wallace's technique for the white balance again. So I'll take my vibrance all the way up and my saturation all the way up to 100. As you can see, it's really blue. So I'm going to bring it to one side or the other. So you basically want it half blue and half yellow, or somewhere in between the two. If it looks too yellow, you've gone too far. If it looks too blue, you haven't gone far enough. So I'm going to get it to around about there. And then with the green and magenta, it's probably about there. And then I'll reset vibrance and reset saturation. And that's given a very balanced look to that sky. Again, I prefer a little bit of blue in the sky. You may not, you may prefer a sky looking like this, or you may prefer to push it to the yellow side. It's all down to what you like. So I'm just going to bump it slightly to the blue side, but only a touch from that starting point. Next, I'm going to put a bit of contrast in there. Probably going to bring the exposure up just a touch more. Going to drop the highlights. You can see that highlight is really affecting this kind of glow from the horizon. So in pushing the highlights down, you reduce that light pollution. Again, there was a lot of dust in the atmosphere on this night, so I'm just trying to reduce that amount of glow from that horizon a little bit. I'm going to bring my shadows up a touch, and I'm going to bring my whites up, my blacks down to add to that contrast a bit. And a little bit of clarity. As we can see, as I brought that clarity up, it really showed off that vignette. So one thing I forgot to do was a lens profile, and that has changed it quite a bit. So you can see the mistake I made there was to put the lens corrections on afterwards. It's corrected it quite a bit, but then I need to bring those settings back a touch. So I'll just bring the exposure down a touch, and that should kind of compensate for that late introduction of lens corrections. Remember, put the lens corrections on earlier rather than later, and then you won't have to almost edit the image twice. I probably should have lined the middle up a little bit more, or took my time to do that, because it's not quite lined up, but I can pull it to one side a little bit and try and get it lined up a bit better. And that looks now like those dots are running down the middle. Last thing I'll do, add a bit of sharpening, get that mask on there quite a lot, and then a touch of noise reduction. With my astrophotography shots, I always do add a little bit of noise reduction, but only a tiny little bit. Like I've already said, if you take this noise reduction too far, it gives a really painterly look to that sky. So I have it between 10 and 20, no more, and sometimes a little bit less, but no more than 20. Now this last image was at a Bortle 6 location. There are not that many stars in the sky, but with a little bit of editing we can pull those out a touch. I've done my trick of finding a dip in the landscape, and I've hidden behind this sand dune. The horizon did have a lot of light pollution on it, so I hid behind this sand dune. I aimed the camera up a little bit. And again, this is a good trick. If there's lots of light pollution on that horizon, find a dip in the landscape or a mountain to kind of hide the light pollution behind, and then you can point the camera further up into the sky, getting a better resolution on those stars. But this is a tricky one, and it'll be interesting to see how much I can make those stars pop out of that sky. I'm guessing not that much, but we'll see. So on this one, I was on the 24mm Sony lens. I had it at ISO 800 and at 13 seconds. And that shows how much more light is in this shot compared to those other shots. At 13 seconds, ISO 800 and at f2, got a wider aperture, but the ISO's lower and the exposure's shorter as well. So that shows that at a Bortle 6 location, there's a lot more light about. Anyway, I'll go through it again. The exposure looks good, so I'll bring up the contrast. Again, I'm going to switch these backwards and forwards. I'm going to take the highlights down a touch. Again, the sand dune looks quite green because I think I lit it with my phone again, but we're going to adjust that in a bit. So with these first few movements on the slider, I'm just concentrating on the sky. Once again, I'm going to put lens corrections on this shot. Then I'm going to bring up the whites, push down the blacks. And as you can see, pushing down the blacks, bringing up the whites, has made that part of the Milky Way pop out just a touch. Next, I'm going to work on the white balance because this sky is quite blue. So once again, vibrance up, saturation up. Then up comes that yellow. So we're going to get it half and half. So half yellow, half blue. And then with the magenta, don't want it too green, don't want it too magenta. So about there. And then reset vibrance and then reset the saturation. That's given us an okay color on the sky. Again, because of my preference, I'm going to push it just a touch to the blue again. Next, I'm going to work on the clarity and texture sliders. Now, these two sliders come in really handy when you're at a location where there's a lot of light pollution. So I'm going to bring the clarity slider up quite a bit. So you can see straight away, that's brought out the Milky Way quite a bit, and it's brought out a few of these stars. I'm going to try the same with a texture slider as well. See how it's brought out those stars? So these two sliders are really good when you have a lot of light pollution. So next I'm going to work on this sand dune. Again, it's quite green. So I'm going to use the adjustment brush for this. So I'm going to click on that. I'm going to get rid of the feather because I want to follow this edge of the dune. I'm going to click on auto mask. I'm going to bring my flow up to 100. I'm going to check this show selected mask overlay, and then I'm going to paint on it. So in red, it's showing me the mask. I'm going to paint just up to this edge. So when I make the changes to this mask, it's just going to change the dune. The auto mask hasn't worked very well in this circumstance, so I'm going to have to do it by hand. So I've switched the auto mask off. I'm going to paint up as close to that line as possible. When you're making changes to your minus tool, you've got to hold down Option or Alt and then change these. So I'm dropping my feather, bringing the size up a bit. We've got the flow on 100. And that'll do me. So I'll zoom back out. So as you can see, the mask overlays the whole of that sand dune. So I'm going to uncheck Show Selected Mask Overlay. Now we're going to get rid of that green color. So we're going to push it to magenta. I'm going to add some yellow as well. And that will be all right, about there. Next thing, I'm just going to do a bit of sharpening up to around about 60. I'm going to put that mask on that and then add a bit of noise reduction. About there. So as you can see, when you're at a location where there's lots of light pollution, it's a lot harder to make the image good and to make it look like a compelling image. but there's a few changes that you can do to make those stars pop out. And that's mainly the texture and clarity slider. They really make those stars pop out, and if you have any of the Milky Way in your shot, the clarity slider will bring that out. So I've just switched it back to what the shot started at, and then if we undo that, you can see I've made it pop out a little bit. Again, it's not a great shot, but it's an okay shot. And if you're just getting into astrophotography and you don't have access to really dark locations, these are the changes you can make to make the stars pop out of your skies as much as possible. Now there's one change I might make because we've got all this light pollution on the horizon. I'm just going to put a graduated filter in, drop those highlights down a bit more, and then maybe drop that yellow color a bit more, not too much. So as you can see, finding a dark sky is imperative. It was really easy to edit these shots from a portrait in New Zealand, whereas it was much harder at this Bortle 6 location. That's when I really struggled to get those stars to come out. I did boost them out a little bit and we can see the Milky Way a little bit, but it was nowhere near as easy as it was at this Bortle, I think it was a Bortle 2 location. And the atmosphere was so clear that even though there was 25% moonlight, the Milky Way really still did shine out, and you could see it with the naked eye. It was actually fantastic. So if you can only get to a Bortle 5 or 6 location, it's much better to have an idea or plan a vacation or save up for a trip to go to a much darker location. And then you'll get some fantastic shots, and that'll make the editing process a lot easier. Now, how are you getting on in editing your astrophotography shots? Are you struggling, or do you find it quite easy? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video and want to learn more about astrophotography, click on this playlist here. And if you've seen some of those but want to learn more about taking astrophotography photos, click on this video down here. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for weekly tutorials in photography. I'll see you next time.